Hello. Today we're going to continue talking about the immune system, but we're going to transition into adaptive immunity, starting with a focus on antigens. So take a look at this image from approximately 15th century China. And what do you think is happening? There's a cute little cat down there. But hopefully we're noticing that this man seems to have some sort of marks on his body. Those scars are a sign of smallpox. And then this figure over here is demonstrating what Chinese people used to do with smallpox. They would take this little scab or that scar tissue from someone who's been infected, and then they would grind it into a powder and inhale it because they thought that if they inhaled it, it would prevent them from getting the disease later on. Sometimes they would also use like a sharp object like a needle, and then they would rub it on an infected person's scab, and then they would take the needle and then they would rub it on the uninfected person to try to basically protect themselves. So, a lot of people are scared of the COVID vaccine right now. I think we should tell them this story and they'll feel better about it. Here is another example of probably the most famous hands in history. These are Sarah Nelm's hands, and she was a milkmaid, and she actually got cowpox from one of her cows named Blossom. And then she went to see her doctor because she was afraid that she might have smallpox, which killed like 10 to 20% of the population. So, very dangerous disease. Her doctor was named Edward Jenner, and he looked at her hands and he concluded, "Oh, it's okay, you only have cowpox, not smallpox." So she was happy because that meant that he was going to survive. But then, since he'd seen her hands, it gave him an idea to do an experiment because he had heard that having cowpox makes you immune to having smallpox, and he wanted to test this out. So, like the Chinese people, he collected some pus from Sarah's hands, and then he actually injects it into an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. It was the son of his gardener, so I'm just imagining him playing in the backyard, and then Jenner injects him with this pus. Phipps becomes sick, but he does recover. And then, to further test his theory, Jenner actually exposes him to smallpox, which, you're gonna die. Oh my gosh. But turns out he didn't die. And this is our the first record of like what we would call a vaccine, of taking a particle of a pathogen from someone who's been sick and putting it in someone who's healthy, and it protects them. By the way, vaccination comes from the Latin word vacca, which means cow. So it all comes back to Blossom. Let's think about these stories and what they tell us about adaptive immunity. So, one big takeaway is that adaptive immunity is specific. It's able to recognize and target particular pathogens. The cowpox and the smallpox were similar enough that the body was able to recognize the smallpox from meeting cowpox. It's also systemic. It affects the whole body system. Most of the innate immune system is localized, which means that it only affects the area that's injured. So adaptive is different because it affects all the body systems. And the adaptive immune system also had a memory because when the 8-year-old boy was first infected with cowpox and then later on infected with smallpox, his body was able to remember that over a period of time. And since our bodies are able to remember things, it lets us mount stronger attacks the next time. So, adaptive immunity is pretty cool. There's one downside: it takes time for this system to be able to come into effect. The innate defenses are basically always ready to react, but the adaptive have to meet the pathogen, and then it takes a little bit of time for them to mount an attack before stuff can start happening. We're going to talk about two separate but overlapping parts of adaptive immunity. So we're breaking adaptive into humoral and cellular. Humoral immunity has to do with B cells or B lymphocytes, and they produce antibodies that float in our plasma, which is what's called humors, like the fluid in our body was called our humors, hence the name humoral immunity. And then cellular immunity are actual cells that are able to affect like virus infected or cancerous body cells. So this yellow thing is a cancer cell, and these little pink things are T cells or T lymphocytes that are fighting it off. So two things working together to protect us. Will you please humor me and say antibody generating 5 times fast? Antibody generating, antigen. I don't know if you tried saying it or if you kind of came up with this. Antigen, antibody generating is a contraction and it forms the word antigen, or antigen is a contraction of antibody generating. So we can define an antigen as anything that generates an antibody. So an antigen is something that our body recognizes as foreign, and then it mounts an immune response against it. The antigen could be like a marker on a bacteria or a virus, or if you're allergic, it could be like the markers on peanuts or something like that. It could even be pet fur or dander. Just anything that's going to cause that immune response. I hope this sounds familiar to us from blood typing. So, like blood type A, it's called A because it has the A antigens, and then it has the anti B antibodies and the anti Rh antibodies. So, if you were to take the B, type B blood, and put it into type A, it would generate these antibodies to be able to fight it off. So, the same thing happening here. We are going to expand our definition of antigen to anything that can trigger the immune response. So here we have a generic antigen. This could be a red blood cell with an A antigen, or it could be like pet fur with its antigens on it. Notice that there are different antigenic determinants. So the shapes coming off of these antigens are different, and they are complementary to different antibodies. So this antibody A that has like the triangle shape is able to bond with the triangle antigenic determinant. And same thing over here. So we have to have a complementary shape to be able to bind. That's how our immune system is able to be specific. It recognizes the specific shapes of the antigenic determinants. Let's talk a little bit about self-antigens. So all of our cells in our body, if we're healthy and everything works as it's supposed to, all the cells in our body have self-antigens. And these identify our cells as our cells, basically. That's why if you try to do like a blood transfusion or an organ transplant, the body will reject those as not being our own cells. So the self-antigens are called MHC proteins. MHC stands for major histocompatibility complex. Histo means tissue. And then this diagram is just showing us all the types. So we have a white blood cell, a nerve cell, epithelial cell, muscle cell. They're all covered in these MHC proteins. The MHC proteins come from MHC genes, and there are millions of combinations of MHC genes that are possible. So it's very unlikely that anyone is going to have the same MHC proteins unless if you're identical twins and literally have the same DNA. This is another image showing an MHC protein a little bit zoomed in so we can see it more accurately. So this purple rectangle part right here is the MHC protein. And the MHC protein is holding a peptide or like another smaller protein. And this peptide could either be like a self antigen, like it could be a miscroy antigen, or it could be a foreign antigen. Like if I'm infected with COVID or something, then the MHC protein could hold a COVID antigen to show around. We'll return back to this idea later if you feel confused, but just recognizing that the MHC protein has two parts for right now.